And
So Daniel, welcome. So we're now recording this session, a conversation between Daniel Christian Wahl and Isabel Carlisle, and we're going to see a little bit about how we came to bioregions and bioregioning.
First of all, let me apologize that I came in a bit late. I was so excited about setting the Samhain fire that I completely lost track of time and realized, must go back to the computer. So but I'm really, really glad that we have this opportunity, and also that so many friends are showing up for this. Lovely to see Jenny, and also like this is like a preamble to our in-person meeting soon. So yes, what brought me to bioregions? I did a course in holistic science at Schumacher College over 20 years ago, and so not far from where Isabel started the Bioregional Learning Center. And in all the learning that I did there, I understood that the globalizing trend towards ever bigger systems was definitely part of the death blow to our planet and our future if we weren't to find a balancing force to this, what was at that point, like this was early 2000s, where the 90s had just gone into this craze of neoliberal economic expansion and small companies having to either go global or go bust. And there was a lot of pressure on people to just go more and more global. And at Schumacher, there was a lot of talk about local, but I also came across the work of Peter Berg and Raymond Asmund and Kirkpatrick Sale around appropriate scale, and what is the appropriate scale to participate in the complex dynamic system that is a living, breathing planet that is structured as life is structured in nested wholeness. And so I realized that you could either have the endless battle between the ultra-local self-sufficiency guy and the globalist, or you could find a ground where that conversation could actually unfold potential, because certain things just can't happen at this ultra-local self-sufficiency scale. Like I live that in my own body as somebody who's spent a lot of time with the Global Eco Village Network and really believing in this idea of just building small intentional communities, and then just realizing that while they're wonderful living laboratories for accelerated learning, they're not capable of regeneratively fitting into life's patterns because they're operating only at that local scale. And so for me, that necessity, that like trying to refit humanity back into life's fundamental regenerative patterns requires us to understand how do we do this in a scale linking global local way. And bioregioning is smack right there in that larger. Also, maybe the one additional thing which I also said in the opening, there's something magical about going to that scale, because to me it's the scale at which you can almost encompass all the complexity of the larger planetary system and all it with all its wicked problem or amazing potential clusters. And at the same time, it helps to reduce that global wicked problem cluster problem, like that we discuss in the World Problematique or in COP20, whatever we want to continue to. And suddenly it flips that around into a scale at which all those problems show up, but they show up through unique people in unique places and unique companies and unique organizations and histories and cultures and ecosystems. And by becoming specific rather than staying in the abstract, again, and this is where I think we meet with our passion for bioregionalism, is that's the scale where you can actually manifest what is potential and flip what seemingly seems like unsurmountable problems into a feast of human imagination, collaboration, and co-creation.
Yeah, that's very beautifully put. So before I offer my thoughts, is there anybody here in this group who would put their hand up to be a scribe, to work into our Google Doc? Jenny, are you putting your hand up?
We can have more than one person, by the way. It's a Google Doc, so a few people.
Away as
fantastic. You're a star.
But I'm not sure if I'm capturing it beautifully. So if anyone wants to help, I'd be happy.
Yeah, make it a team effort.
Fantastic. Okay, very good. Well, I'm sitting in South Devon, which is a bioregion defined by water. It's defined by rivers just two sides, the sea to the south and where our rivers rise to the north. And I also encountered bioregions through Schumacher College. Perhaps that's not a coincidence, but through the work of Kirkpatrick Sale. So Kirkpatrick Sale led a 3-week short course at Schumacher College about 25 years ago now, at which he and his students did a bioregional analysis of the Dart Valley. And the River Dart and its valley is where I live. Totnes is in the River Dart, on the River Dart. And they produced a little booklet called Dartia. Everybody said to me at Schumacher College, you've got to go and read this booklet, but nobody could find it. So it took me several months to track it down in the Totnes archive. So thanks to Kirkpatrick Sale, but also thanks to a young friend of mine called Isak Stoddard at Uppsala University, who, knowing that I was interested in bioregions, sent me this paper by Donella Meadows, an unpublished paper, which is now making its way across various networks. So it's in the public domain, which was about bioregions. And she wrote this around 1980-82, when she co-founded the Balaton Group. And she talked about bioregional learning centers and what they could achieve if every bioregion had a learning center that was kind of like a repository for all the ancient knowledge, the traditional ways of doing things, as well as contemporary technology, as well as being a broadcasting station for telling people what was going on, as well as being like a kind of telephone exchange to connect people up, and was able to speak to farmers and fishermen, but also to policymakers and government officials, and was able to kind of, in a sense, model the future with the resources at hand. And I found that so inspiring that it's guided our work here ever since. But the reason I love bioregions, I think, is it's kind of like, it's a bell that rings true. It's an islands of coherence is how I think of them. And I'm not the first person to coin that phrase of islands of coherence. But certainly I learned through creating a story of place for our bioregion. And in regenerative design, the way we do that is to layer up all these different stories. So layer up the deep time story of geology, and then you kind of layer up the landscape scale, and then you layer up the social history and the economic history and the fauna and the flora and the rainfall and so on. And you're looking for a kind of coherence that is running down through all those different layers and gives you a sense of both about the history of your bioregion and its very specific characteristics, but also gives you a sense of where the edges of your bioregion are. And these are not clearly defined hard and fast edges. They're much more like fuzzy boundaries. But for me, that was deeply satisfying, maybe through having been an archaeologist and having worked with the Neanderthal cultures and recognizing that, as I said at the opening plenary, that Neanderthals organize themselves into bioregions. It's how Indigenous people organize themselves, and knowing where our water is and where different kinds of wood are, where our healing plants are. In one way, it sounds romantic. In another way, it's completely practical, and it's probably where we need to be going now. So that's how I arrived at bioregions and bioregioning. And my next question really to put on the table for Daniel and myself to answer is that bioregions are clearly not neutral spaces. They're not simply areas of territory. The way that we're all talking about them now in this summit, and have been for some years now, is that they have a set of values, a kind of ethos, a set of principles. And certainly I recognize that in thinking about bioregions, I'm bringing to this work inspiration from many different people, or ways of thinking about the world that I've learned along the way. And I thought it might be useful to unpack some of those and put them on the table in the same way that commons are kept alive by commoning, bioregions are kept alive by a suite of practices that we could call bioregioning. So I don't want to go too far into bioregioning today, but I am really fascinated, Daniel, to hear what you think about what are the principles, what's the ethos that we are weaving for bioregions at this time.
For me, there's a powerful word that I believe one of the Gary Snyder, one of the poets of the American bioregional movement, coined this term, re-inhabitation. And for those of you who can quickly Google something or just put it in Nicosia better, there's a paper where he speaks to, like at the 1977 conference on re-inhabitation in the Bay Area, he gave an address, and for me that address is really, really timely for where we are now, because he ends with a kind of almost presaging of all these crazy things we had to live with billionaires zooming off into space, by saying something like, some people say humankind has a destiny in space, and then he says, well, we're already there, we're on this living biosphere zooming through space. And he ends up saying we need to make ourselves in full alignment with the remaining inhabitory cultures in order to learn how to re-inhabit deeply. And that's very different in different places. And the more I tune into this amazing quickening of a new pattern of dwelling or re-inhabiting the planet that is somehow spreading across the globe right now, and why there is a summit that is called Bioregional Regeneration Summit, I really feel we are trying to experiment with this process of re-inhabitation. And it's really difficult. And then many of us are displaced in the sense that we're doing it in the region that, not the region we were born into, but another region. Like, I'm German, and I lived most of my life outside of Germany, and made this island of Mallorca my home 12 years ago because it was a defined bioregion. So I didn't have to have too much conversations about how do we define our bioregion, which can get tricky when you're pushing it just around the watershed or something. But yeah, for me, I feel like I might have had moments in the past where I was more cocky about some sort of master plan of how to, don't you see, it all fits together and we can create a perfect bioregion if you just listen to the right people. And I feel like the more I'm actually trying to work this, the more humbled I get. How deeply subtle re-inhabitation is, and how suggesting anything is quite impertinent. And so, yeah, so this deeper process of how do we come home to place? What is this place? And for me, like one thought exercise that helps with this humbling is the deep lesson that I personally have drawn from studying relationships that first, like place-based and inhabitory people all over the world have had to their places, which is not necessarily this is our place, but we are an expression of this place. And so that really puts you into a whole different perspective of re-inhabiting, because you're not saying, okay, let's get all the systems designers in and all the clever people, and let's just map it all out, and let's just design hackathon the hell out of it and bring the super experts from California in, and then we solve the problems of this bioregion, and we link with finance, and we do a bit of regen finance, blah, 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 and smack something into this place that is well intended, but offered by people who have absolutely no idea who they were talking to and what their place really is, and have not lived there long enough to understand the touchy points in the culture that you better not touch, because they will bring up open wounds and trauma that either you're there to heal it or you have a counter reaction and don't know where it came from. I mean, when you really start working in a kind of indirect work, as Carol Sanford now calls it, way, with complex dynamic systems, knowing you can't manipulate them, you can't predict them, you can't control them, but with the best of intentions, trying to work for positive emergence in these systems by connecting the right people, by planting memes, and yes, by exploring visions as suggestions, not as imposed things. Yeah, I'm rambling a bit, but I think all of that is, for me, crucial around this process of how do we become expressions of place again? How do we re-inhabit this place? And knowing that we'll never get there. It's an intention, it's a pilgrimage, it's a commitment to a way of journeying into place that, yeah, like Rilke's invitation of living the question, that like one fine day we might just become expressions of place if we humbly live into the questions of how we could become expressions of place again.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Re-inhabiting place. I think it was probably Gary Snyder who gave that address to the conference in California. I certainly feel that part of what I'm doing here is re-inhabiting place, and the sense of being claimed by a place is very strong for me. There's a lot of talk about indigeneity, but as probably most people on this call know, Britain, having had an empire and becoming colonizers, in fact, had been colonized for centuries and centuries before that. So our sense of indigeneity is a very fragmented one. And what we see on our landscape here goes back to the Bronze Age invaders of 4,000 years ago. So it's always a kind of contested space. But I think that while I really hear your plea for distinctiveness of bioregions and not imposing ways of how to create a bioregion or how to regenerate a bioregion onto places, I do think that one really valuable thing that bioregions do is to make systems visible and to help you understand that in your bioregion, there are many overlapping systems. So there's your water system, there's biodiversity, there's tree cover, there's soil, there are all of these natural systems. And of course, there are human created systems within that as well. So there's your transport system, there's your health system, and so on. So for us in South Devon, we talk a lot of the time about working at this place of friction where natural systems and human systems meet, particularly now when Gaia's on the move. You've got great geosystems kind of destabilized, operating in unpredictable ways. So how does our fresh water distribution system cope with that? And it's very, these are intervention points, like acupuncture points, that you can really work into, because this sense of kind of crisis in a way, or urgency, is also moderated by a little bit about what you've been talking about, which is kind of going back down the centuries and seeing how in the past, people of that place have coped with systemic change, or what their culture has been around addressing kind of crises that we're facing now. So for me, it's about systems and thinking in systems and really kind of broadening our brains to be able to conceive of multiple systems overlapping in unpredictable ways. And then there's the piece about relationship. So as we know, living systems are all about flows and networks and relationships. And then how do you enable those flows and networks, relationships in your bioregion to be regenerative? So regeneration, I think, is a kind of part of the ethos that's growing around our current practice of working in bioregions. I know, any more thoughts on that before we might move on and open this up?
I'd love to follow on that. Yeah, just briefly, because it reminds me, as I kind of said, I got switched onto bioregions 20 years ago at Schumacher College and ended up in 2006 writing a PhD on design for human and planetary health, where I talked about, actually Stuart Cohen, who's also been on this conference call a number of times, and when you wrote a book with Sim van der Rim called Ecological Design, they explored scale linking design as a critical way of refitting us into the system. And again, bioregions being the central entry point there. And then you can come in through food sovereignty, water sovereignty, energy sovereignty, those kind of issues. Like, how do we provision basic needs of the local population, and what do we have to work with in this local situation in terms of where does our water come from, where does our energy come from, and so on. I mean, all of these are really powerful entry points. And for me, that's what bioregional learning, as it continues in this sort of spiral way where people follow their interest and explore Devon or Mallorca through the lens of water. But for me, it would be like, where does water start in us? Like, because the like human and nature contact points seems yet again as if there's an other nature out there, rather than like we're basically full of microplastics and the bioaccumulation of whatever is in our local water system from industrial processes. So really bringing people, because those kind of entry points straight into the body then also allow for the longer geological history and the mining history and whatever, to say, oh, we've got a lot of lead in this county in our blood. That's because there was a lead mine 100 years ago, 200 years ago. But also with regard to this that you alluded to, that more and more people are spending quite a lot of time arguing of whether we first need to fundamentally accept a collapse at a magnitude that we're not willing to fully accept yet, that will definitely come, in order to then, with more clarity and a different way of setting priority, work around bioregional learning. That's one end of the spectrum. Or the other end of the spectrum is sort of, no, we can get through the eye of the needle if we prepare, but do so as a planetary species, aware that it doesn't work if we just create bioregions as lifeboats. We need to create bioregions as a place, a strategy of re-inhabitation, and enable people everywhere around the globe to do the same in their place. And that means readdressing the traumas of colonialism, neo-colonialism, and global inequality in the process. And I think those kind of issues are also critical, but like in terms of strategy and systems, I learned a lot from, I don't know if she in the end did give the other opening, Helena Norberg-Hodge, who was scheduled to give the opening, and Local Futures. I know Helena for more than 20 years. And she was really a pioneer, at least in the UK, to bring the conversation around local food, and which is now about Kilometer Zero and so on, to really look at how do we support our local economy by supporting our local farmers, and to look at the link between farmers being guardians of ecosystems and seasonality and awareness of what are you actually condoning when you eat strawberries out of season, and what are you doing to your body. And so for me, powerful entry points that we might also want to map, if you want to go into the kind of how do you work, dance with the complex dynamic system that is your bioregion. I would say food is powerful, and food always goes to health and water and energy really quickly. Like it's just allowing for a systemic conversation that lands with everybody, because you kind of go, oh yeah, and who grew the grain that you're eating in that bread, and where did that come from, and how did it get here, and how much energy did it take to get here? And suddenly you're in a systemic conversation.
Yeah, I love that. I love what you said about bioregions as a strategy of re-inhabitation. And you're absolutely right, both food and water get you into that place of it goes everywhere. It impacts on everything, and people really can get viscerally connected to that. I think that's really important. But I'm wondering if we can I see there's some energy for that perhaps in the chat, and some great questions coming up in the chat as well. Whether we can kind of set out some first principles for bioregions, not this is how you do it necessarily, but here are some strategies that have worked. And if you're going to think about bioregioning, where do you start? I was wondering if we could just kind of keep it super helpful, super simple, as well as super helpful. And I'd love to kind of open it up a bit to the floor as well, to pitch in with some ideas about what these principles might be. Is there energy for doing that?
Just briefly, in terms of, like, for me, it always helps. Just my entry point is rarely principles, because it feels too much like I'm defining something that I want people to sign up to and question. Yeah. It's the same thing. I know it's the same thing, but you can frame a principle in the form of a question, and then it's an invitation to a conversation. So, like, I feel more comfortable in a space discussing what questions should we ask if we want to enter into bioregioning, but that might help people.
Lovely.
And other people might need principles, and both is fine. We don't have to have a discussion about whether it's questions or principles. It just helps me to frame it that way, because it liberates my mind in a different way.
Well, sure, let's do it that way. And are people, Jenny, are you still happy to keep on writing and scribing? Do you need some help?
No, I've been swapping in and out. Somebody else took over, so I'm just hanging fire at the moment, but I don't know who took over. We're all anonymous something or other writing in there.
All right, fabulous, thank you.
Jenny probably has a good idea of where to start on this question, because I mean, in your Power of Place course, you do find a structure that allows people in. So maybe we start there. I don't know.
I could try. Yeah, I'm kind of with you on the questions thing, but I think there are many different approaches into bioregionalism, and it is very unique to the place that you want to work with, what approach you might take. So, for example, in Fife in Scotland, it is rising, which is a bioregion you know well, Daniel, having spent a lot of time up there. The conversation is rising through what is endemic to that bioregion through food, through a discussion around food security, and the realization that almost everything that they produce, they export. And the question is that a resilient approach to an uncertain future in the challenges of climate change that they are looking at? Where I live in Sussex, which is the south of England, it's a very different landscape. So the work that I am doing here is very much more, I would actually describe it as a sniff and respond test. So it's an ability to gain a very deep sense of what is happening in this space across what I think of as a layer cake. So if the base of the layer cake is the health of our living system, the life support systems on which we depend, what is happening in that part of the cake? What is happening within the part of the layer cake that is human cultural systems? What is rising here is a really deep interest in deep democracy processes and participatory democracy. And at the human economic systems level, finally, after 5 years of trying, what is rising here is a curiosity about what a regenerative economy might look like in the coastal zone. So in terms of a bioregioning approach here, it's more about sensing into all of those different parts of the whole and trying to weave conversations together so that the system eventually sees itself. On the very small island of Jersey, we took a very different approach to really deeply mapping the systems around, again, food on the island, because the island is a place that has a single day of food security. But actually not just mapping who was excluded from the dominant business as usual food system of imports and supermarkets. How did power flow through that system? Where was agency? Where wasn't agency? What was the cultural response of people to food? And in deeply mapping that system, almost using a service design process, it becomes evident that, or it became evident, that the first possible interaction to bring the bioregion alive through food was the creation of a social enterprise that addressed both the people who were excluded from the food system, who were organic farmers, but that also simultaneously gave people the opportunity to join that social enterprise and experience the taste of food in a totally different way. So that's 3 areas, but 3 very, very different approaches. I don't know if that's helpful.
That's very helpful. Yes, thank you so much for sharing that. I think what we could do is take one question from a hand raised and then one from the chat, because I'm seeing hands raised and great questions in the chat. So Michael Lennon, would you like to go first with your question?
Hello. I think I'd like to offer an appreciation of a moment of insight, something Daniel said that kind of blew my mind, say why, and then if he has some advice to offer about how to build on that. So one of the things that I have been a lifelong thinker, how I've thought, is that the world is a bunch of nouns. If I just find the labels for reality, bioregion or whatever, then I can manipulate those nouns and do whatever there is to do. And one of the ways in which some are inviting us to think differently is that the world, instead of being nouns, are verbs. So instead of me being a self, I'm a being, right? And so it's a different way of participating in the space. So when there was this question of first principles as a way of kind of making sense of reality, that is a kind of declare your noun and then manipulate accordingly. And this idea of turning it into a question was like, oh yeah, it's a way of exploring the space that does not reduce it to the noun. Now, and I was like, wow. Now it's obvious to some and not to others, but on my own, call it sacred journey, some of these, each time that my way of understanding has kind of been expanded, there's been this kind of whether I step away or get related to what it is that I now understand as a bigger picture, and if the is there any advice to, for somebody who may not know what they don't know, and their picture is becoming bigger, they may recoil, or how to lean forward into not knowing and mystery, and how to be, the word is maybe better related to not knowing, how to be in the inquiry when you don't know where the inquiry will lead. I hope that question made sense, and thank you.
So that was to me.
Yeah, go ahead, Daniel. Absolutely.
Wow. Okay. First of all, just a brief comment about the power of leading or inviting through questions and living the questions together, which can frustrate some people because people really see the urgency of the need for solutions. If you can get people, even just for a while, into a space where they suspend judgment about their pet solution, whether it's coming in from the social, ecological, economic, or worldview dimension, whether it's a new cryptocurrency or a compost toilet or whatever, like people have pet solutions. And if you can invite them into a living the questions space in which they can still explore their solutions, but don't have to argue whether that's the final one and the only one, and don't you see. You can create briefly spaces where more collective intelligence can emerge. And like in a very different space, working with the way of counsel and counsel circles and speaking from the heart and listening from the heart, that's actually where this living the question insight came through to me, because so many times over years we always came back to what are we doing in counsel? We're living the question. And what is counsel? Counsel is checking in with self, with community, and with our own ability to connect to our larger intelligence, which is life itself. So it's the small voice within, which is more the intuition, and that is formed by narrative and those kind of things. But there's also the larger self that can inform. But the other question is putting me into too much of a position of advising on something that I grapple with myself. Like I can't give advice on personal development. I get smacked around the face regularly to see how much work I still have to do myself. But there is, in my own vulnerability and humility around that subject at the moment, having become a father 5 years ago and understanding the world of a lot of people very differently since then. There's, for me, an invitation where maybe I'm building an excuse for myself, where I feel called into things and I have to step back and I have to say, there's a time and there's a speed and there's a rhythm. And just because there's potential, it doesn't mean it has to be now. Coming into finding synergy with something and then working on creating syntony with that something are two different processes. And sometimes stepping back to saying, okay, I feel really called to do this, but maybe I'm not quite ready yet because I actually have an obligation to do X, Y, and Z also. And to be hard with oneself of, is it because I don't want to let go of this, or is it because that's actually also important? And so I don't know if that's an answer to what you were asking in the second part of that question, but I heard that as a very deep request for advice, which I don't know whether I can give, but what's helping me at the moment is to understand that I have to say no to some amazing potential sometimes, because I have other commitments as well, and there will be other times again.
Yeah, Daniel, thank you for that. We had a
Thank you.
very good session this morning with bioregions in the Arctic, mainly in Iceland.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a very good contribution within that session about windows of opportunity. So windows of opportunity present themselves. Often you don't see them for what they are until several years down the line. But then there's also a choice. Do you choose to step through this window of opportunity or not? And I think that sense of knowing when the time is right, for me, is a very important ingredient to doing this work. And as Jenny was saying, sense and see what is arising in the place where you're working. What is the right way to connect with that place? Is there a window of opportunity there? Do I choose to step through it? I think that would be a good question that I always pose to myself, like, what is the project? Do I choose to get involved with that? So a question in the chat. Eduardo Esparza asked a good question. What is the balance of use of modern technology and bioregions? What is the role of modern tech, if there is one at all? How would we come up with modern tech for bioregions? So I thought I might start answering that one and then hand to Daniel. I think modern tech does have a very important role to play. I think if we think about living systems and the ways in which nutrients flow through them, for humans, a lot of those, the equivalent of nutrients is information, and how we share information, making it accessible, making it something that's co-generated, in which we are able to, kind of share both our successes and our failures. I think that's very valuable. It's something where this project would like to go. And certainly in our bioregion, when we're thinking quite a lot about governance and what bioregional governance looks like, and we recognize that data is like the lifeblood of governance, we recognize it's important for communities, people on the ground, to have access to the data that they need. Like, how do they know if their river's in good health? Or how do they know the impact of climate change on their food systems? How do they share that data? A lot of those people on the ground can see before their eyes what's actually happening, but they have no mechanism for sharing that or for validating it or being validated. So I think it is important that data and what seems a very old way of being, which is the bioregioning way of being, find a way to dialogue with each other. Daniel, I don't know if you'd like to add on to that one.
Well, it's for me, it's a really high explosive power question, because we need to first understand that exponential tech as it is evolving right now is an existential risk to humanity. And some of the people on the call know the work of Daniel Schmachtenberger. It's pretty hard to listen to him speak because he's so integrating so many spaces that it's yeah. But anyway, he is one of those more California perspective people that say exponential tech is somewhat unstoppable. So how do we somehow rein it in? I in this case would say we really need to live that question of how do we make tech a servant to humanity again and not its master, and how do we even have that conversation in a civilization where currently power and wealth is accumulated with people who are extremely technophilic and maybe not able to even see that there are other solutions, arrogant enough to not understand that survival for our species for hundreds of thousands of years has been technology, like the Way of Counsel, like Vision Quest, like rituals of rites of passage, like true dialogue with the ecosystem that brings you forth. And we don't see these technologies because for us technology has a certain form. And I think the printing press, the spoken word, all of them are technologies. And the Bible says in the beginning there was the word. Upstream of any design process is the mental framing, the scaffolding that changes how people see the world and themselves, and then everything downstream changes. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. Brilliant. Melina, what's your question? Observation, perhaps.
Thank you, Isabel, and thank you, Daniel and Jenny and everyone. Yeah, I was thinking about your first question to everyone about how we bring this kind of sharing knowledge to the bioregion, and how we start bioregioning. And I want to share and bring some questions about my experience in Colombia, because what we have been observing is that bioregions have their own, let's put it in very simple words, as needs, and for different regions and different villages and different watersheds, and there are different needs and different priorities, and what we have found as very useful is to deepen, like listening very deeply those needs and those, because that is what can bring forward what it needs to be done. And that, I think, that answered many of the other questions that had been asked about technology or anything else, because it's like a deep listening of what is calling the attention. And we had been talking in other sessions about the deep connection with the soul and the deep connection with the shadow work that we are like facing in this effort of bioregional regeneration. So listening what it is emerging at this specific region, at this specific culture or connections between people is one of the things that we found very valuable for in Colombia for helping bioregions and leverage regeneration in bioregions. And every one of these bioregions have different priorities, and they need to be the first thing to do, like really addressing those things. And that brings me to the question, or I would like to explore with you both on how or like this humbling space of not trying to do anything top down or mapping and over design and things like that. What aspects of this how can I say it? Like the parasitism of this paradigm that we had been doing with the regeneration, of how this inner regeneration actions that we have been passing through in order to get into this work, what are the key points for that work? What for you, like how you have been really involving yourselves and this inner regeneration that should be spread into what it is needed, into the deep listening for bioregioning? That could be my question.
That is a very beautiful question.
Thanks.
It's Daniel's turn to go
I
first.
said
it.
Well, pulling a few things that people have said. So Jenny said system seeing itself, connecting people. Isabel said that bioregioning is a relational practice. Different language framing. If you look at the bioregion at this as this scale of complexity that allows for the requisite variety necessary to actually understand your participation in complexity, but then enough reduction of complexity because you're focused on the specific of a bioregion rather than get lost in global problem solving conversations the whole time, then somehow engaging with understanding that if you want to change flows in complex dynamic systems, paying attention to who is connected to whom, what is the quality of that relationship, and what is the quality of the information that flows between those actors. And the reason why this is very abstract and a very specific thing, when you asked your question, you said, how do we start bioregioning? Like, I've come to this insight really strongly in conversations with people about regenerative culture, which is the same thing. Like, how do we re-inhabit our bioregions as regenerative expressions of place? And I suddenly realized, wait a minute, the conceptual framing of anything that starts now as if it's a new thing is the wrong way to go, from my humble opinion. The whole thing about story of place is to understand that there are actors in your landscape who have loved this place deeply and fully and truly for the last 100 years. And if you dig deep enough, you'll see that they have been there for thousands of years. And so it is not a creation of a utopia that we have yet to construct. It is an unveiling, an uncovering, and a reconnecting to a pattern that is in the landscape, because it's life itself speaking to those people who are still willing to listen. And what we're not trying to remind each other is, how do we listen to that? How do we fall in love with place again? And for me, that is where you then can, back to the complex dynamics and systems metaphor, you can say, okay, how do I identify real agents in the system? Here on Mallorca, there's a guy who's fascinated about biochar. And yes, he's selling it at ridiculous prices to very rich people on the island, but he's doing research on how to do really good biochar on the island and is beginning to give some people that actually do the stuff a living working what their passion is. And then there are other people who are initially set up to reduce ocean plastics and created a marine foundation, but they understand that you can't save the ocean if you don't change what people do on the land. And so by making all these different players, local people who have just furthered the local conversation around ethical business for the last 20 years, or other people who work with social inclusion of differently abled people into both growing food or waiting and cooking in a restaurant that processes that local food. And by basically repositioning what we're doing with bioregioning, not as we have this wonderful new idea and let's follow these things that other people have done elsewhere and then we do them here. Great inspirations like doing a local donut or whatever the energy asks for, but so critically weaving the stories together that create a much more complex understanding of the region through the stories of real people told by them. So my theory of change is a sort of mini videos of these different organizations and putting them on a map because they're on that map, they will start looking at other people on that map and they will realize that there's actually human relationships opportunities and maybe even business opportunities there. And then you begin a kind of broth of conversation within which you can sort of launch, like Jenny was speaking, tests of seeing where does this catch? Like, shall we do a donut, or shall we do a warm data process with Nora Bateson, but really use it to understand what we're missing about what's going on our island. But yeah, these are just sort of thinking out loud.
Yeah, good thinking. So Melina, I love your question. I call bioregioning in the way that we do it here as soul work. I think reconnecting to place is a soul practice. I see that, William, you've posted having a sit spot and using it to learn the languages spoken by the greater than human world is a fantastic tool for falling in love with place. I completely agree. So from the early days of thinking about the South Devon bioregion, I've been going to various different places by the sea or up on the moor or just locally to talk to the place, to talk to the river, to talk to the rocks, to talk to the wind, to kind of really understand who is this place, how does it function, what does this place actually want. So that may sound a little strange, but it's incredibly rewarding, because for me, there's always an answer that comes back that puts me back on track, particularly when I've gone off track and I'm getting too much into my head and I'm overthinking things. So that really kind of grounds me and helps me to see where to go. And I think that also a huge benefit of the reGenesis training that I did, and I know that Jenny and Daniel and other people on this call may have done as well, is understanding that places themselves have agency, that we're not the only ones that have agency. And now more and more, I think that Gaia has agency, geosystems have agency. For so many centuries, humans have assumed that we were the ones with all the power, that we could somehow subdue nature. And the humbling that's going on at the moment is also soul work, in the way that Joanna Macy said that climate change is soul work, it's spiritual work. So I hope that answers your question, Melina. So go on.
Isabel, just very briefly.
Yeah.
You just triggered something in me that I experienced deeply in my gut today. And I'm beginning to why not launch this question to this group? And I know Killian has been waiting for a very long time, so we should give him a chance soon. I suddenly had this sense of unease in my body today. And then I started, like I mentioned it to my wife, and she said, well, maybe it's to do with what's going on the planet. And I looked at the news, and of course, yes, like wonderful that Bolsonaro is out and Lula is in, but this is a high dangerous time in Brazil where we hope that this will be peaceful, this transition. And at the same time, and we don't need to go into the larger resurfacing of evil specters of power groups on the planet. I think there's an intensification of the shelling in Ukraine that could lead to this escalation spiral of bellicose language. And I'm mentioning these two things for two reasons. Like, there's a lot of shit going on the planet at the same time as we're trying to do what we're doing. And if we're actually understanding interbeing and interconnectedness and nested wholeness fully, then as this accelerates, maybe we need to actually begin the work of preparing ourselves for the fact that, and this goes to Melina's question again, the kind of working on self as well as world, to hold what will rise in us as life speaks through us about what's going on the planet, because things are intensifying to a level that those sensitive enough to feel that could also, yeah, I don't know what anybody thinks about that. This is definitely pushing the boat out very far, but I feel more and more that that's also informing how I work with groups, is to really say, if I'm humble enough to let life work through me, then I will start feeling the system. I will start feeling both the ecosystem and the social system through me. And then always checking in, is that just self-deluded projection, or is it actually useful? But anyway.
Daniel and Isabel, sorry, I have to talk again because yesterday I talked to a Hawaiian grandmother. I was inviting her for our closing plenary. And when I was explaining everything about the summit for her to come, she had this vision of me walking with lots of people towards the Kremlin in Moscow to talk with Putin and saying, hey, stop the war. That was her vision about us. So for me, it's really touching that you are saying what you just said, because it's kind of gathering the whole strength and the force that we are really moving towards with our consciousness, and bringing all this consciousness together in order to bring real changes. So I just wanted to share that with you because this is powerful.
That is awesome. Now, I'm just recognizing that we've got to the half hour, i.e. 4:30 in England. And some of you may need to go, but we can certainly keep going for a few minutes longer if Daniel is prepared to keep going for a little bit longer. What do you think, Daniel?
I had a schedule until 6. I mean, I'm happy.
Yes.
There's two little
You've
kids.
got the fire.
Two little kids wanting to start some haying, but I have a schedule. They believe I finish at 6. So if we go 5 to 6, great.
That's what it says on our calendar too, Isabel. So I think a lot of people arrived here thinking this is a 90-minute session. We have the hangout starting in this room in a half an hour, which also can accommodate people that want to continue with this. But yeah, let's keep going.
Okay, well, I can keep going for another 20 minutes for sure. Great, thank you. So Killian, you've been waiting patiently with your hand up. What's your question?
Sound.
Killian, we can't hear you.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. I have a very hard time framing my thinking around all this as questions, frankly. So I'm not sure I'm going to be able to meet that that requirement, although I respect it and understand why, but I just have a hard time doing that. But let me try to frame it as a question, sort of. In conversations about bioregionalism, regenerativeness, it doesn't matter what it is, sustainability, the conversations are always structured in such a way that, well, one, there's no structure, which is, I think, sometimes makes it hard for us to get to understanding. And two, we jump between first order, second order, fourth order, fifth order questions and issues all the time. And it just makes it really hard for all this to make sense, at least to me. And so well, for example, I pasted into the chat some characteristics of regenerative communities, right? Which applies also to bioregions. Those same things must, in my mind, apply to bioregions. So you could think of them as characteristics of any kind of system, actually, that is functioning in a regenerative way. At least that's a list. And then when we're trying to do good problem solving, we generally want to start at first order, first principle issues and solve those, right? Or at least come to some degree of consensus, so that we can then sensibly deal with the second order, the third order, the fourth order. But when we're always bouncing around between them and we never get settled on any of the first order stuff, I don't understand how we get to solutions in the long run. And the only way around that, as far as I can see, is if we take very seriously this idea of simplicity and let things be simpler than we are. If you want to start a bioregional process, walk out your door, find a neighbor, start. You know, I'm not sure it has to be more complex than that. And then through time, you can learn stuff you need to learn. And that's what people do anyway. They come up against a problem and they don't know the answer. So they go find out the answer, right? They go find the information they need to solve that problem. And hopefully, as many have said, I mean, there's just so many things to try to respond to. It's really hard. So I'm trying to keep this very simple. So my question is, I guess, why can't we, or why aren't we keeping it simple? Why aren't we starting with the very simple things of what is regenerative? What do those systems look like? What characteristics do they have? So that we can then have a list of things that are universal for everyone to go for, to work from. Because once you have those principles and characteristics in place, that guides everything that comes after. But we're not doing that. And so I'm not understanding why we, and I don't mean we as in us in this room, I mean we as all the people in any facet of trying to save our asses and the ass of the planet, which is one thing, which is one of the things that we need to realize is we aren't separate at all. And so so why aren't we, and why can't we? Why is it so hard to stay at and deal with first principles, first order thinking in all this? Why is it so hard to do that? Why can't we do that? You know, I guess that's my question in a nutshell.
Okay, so I'll start and then hand over to Daniel. I think one of the things you highlight here with first principles is this idea of solving problems. There's a huge complication in my mind here, a difficulty in my mind. Who defines the issues? Who decides who's going to solve the problems? For instance, just to give a little for instance, that came up on the news today. So in North Cornwall, there's a place called St. Agnes, where lots of surfers go surfing. And there's been a big discharge of sewage into the ocean at that spot. And people are naturally, the local surfers, the local residents are naturally up in arms about it. The Southwest Water say, oh, that's our permitted discharge. And it happened because there was a storm. So Southwest Water is defining the issue very differently to the local community. But it's Southwest Water, of course, that has the money and the agency. So I think one of the things we're doing with bioregions is to make it possible for many more people to have agency. And to me, this question of agency is absolutely key, because if we are able to identify problems and issues together, i.e. civil society is able to take a lead and work with Southwest Water or whoever else it might be, but certainly South community and civil society is in the room saying, these are the issues that we need to solve, give us the agency. I think bioregions have the potential to do that because they are not defined politically, because they are defined geographically, because they're much looser, because it's much more about belonging. But then, of course, we get into issues of governance. But anyway, that's what I wanted to put back to you, or to put into the room here, is that it's getting back to first principles constructed as problems to solve doesn't work. in my mind. It's too complex for that. But I wonder what Daniel thinks.
I find it really interesting that it's coming up, and thanks for raising it, Killian, because for me, part of what we're going to try to do as a group of friends who respect deeply the work of reGenesis Group and Carol Sanford, where this shift from not working on problem solving because it has the educated mental scaffolding and training in us that means problem defining, abstract problem ever abstracter, and then finding solutions to this abstract problem and then reapplying these solutions at all places, scaling them up with no discrimination of the uniqueness of people and place. That's somewhat the critique, to say if you go to the specific of people and place and you work with them, not by saying you have a problem, but by saying what do you want and what does this place want to be born here now, and what wants to arise. You also come to issues that need what is conventionally reframed as here are problems and we need to solve them, but you come to them from a different angle. But the issue that I think is that it is a completely new way of working, and very often when we try to define a new way of working, we can only do so by distinguishing it as the other way of working from the previous way of working, and it can become a little bit dogmatic. And what I hear in your question is, how do we do both? How do we look at what works on first order, but have the maturity to say that the way we think about the problem, the way we define the problem, is second order thinking that is critical on even beginning, not solving the problem, but responding to the unique conditions of that place. And so I think it somehow needs both. But the problem is that the issue is that the knee-jerk response is, here a bunch of problems, get the engineers in, let's solve them, let's finance it, let's do it, it works. How does it work? Give me the 15 principles and the tick list and we'll apply it everywhere. And I think that it is necessary to slow down to ask the question about place-sourced potential, as reGenesis would frame it. And we're missing out on doing it effectively if we don't also see that, case studies and examples of how people have solved similar issues and turned problem into opportunity. In the problem lies the solution, the old permaculture adage, is useful. And there is transferability between climate zones and so on, as long as we have the humility to ask, to also it's just as we do with scale linking design. We focus on one scale, but we need to pulse out and back in to understand how that scale affects the other scales. It's pulsing in and out of the problem solving approach and scanning it and exploring it in a kind of living the question way rather than forcing it, and at the same time flipping it and working from a what's the place sourced potential of the local people and the local culture. I would love to hear you on that, Killian, whether that makes any sense to you.
Is that an invitation to speak, or is that?
Yes, it is an invitation, and you don't need to ask questions. You can also just comment.
It's if I followed you, what you're saying, you're saying what I would say also. I mean, throughout our history of communicating, that's always been the case, where we're agreeing on like 99% of everything. And so this is exactly what I mean. If you walk out your door and you talk to your neighbor and you discuss, hey, are you familiar with these concepts, blah, 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 where can we start, blah, blah, blah. And one of you happens to have in your head all this stuff about principles and blah, and characteristics and stuff and energy and all these things, and one of you doesn't. Then you do some downloading, some teaching, right? But you start acting. in acting, you become the core of that local node of a bioregional network, right? And by encouraging other people in other communities around you to do the same, you're creating that network. And how to do it, that's all design. This is something that is, I think, hard to grasp if you don't come from a design background, maybe. But the framework of a network of communities and networks of communities to create a bioregion, that's simple. And it's not something that's imposing or anything else. It's just what naturally is. We already have it. We're just really badly organized right now. But that's what we see in indigenous cultures, is these sort of wheels all connected by larger spokes, longer spokes within an area or bioregion. That's exactly what we see. So we don't need to keep reinventing these concepts. And the decision-making process, those are all already out there too. And we keep talking about how to do them. Well, just look. You know, I was talking with I forget who it was, Ashish maybe, who did the presentation the other day, and the concept I've been talking about regenerative governance is exactly what that is exactly what that process is. It was amazing because he and I talked later, and it's exactly the same thing. So yeah, we are actually co-creating it all at the same time, because we're starting from zero. But the problem is not taking the time to keep going back to what is foundational until it becomes endemic in our thinking. Because it's not, as far as I can tell, it's far from being endemic to our thinking, especially when you think of, you know, all the people that are involved in trying to create regenerative systems or bioregionalism or all these things. It's simply not. There's not even clear understanding of principles versus non-principles, et cetera. So we have, I think, an opportunity now and a necessity to slow down for a period of time and take the permaculture first principle really seriously. Observe first, take the time to understand your system, and then sit down and define it a little bit and figure out what, you know, make your lists of needs and etc.
Gillian, I'm going to interrupt you there very politely. We've got some other. We agree with you. I mean, we don't disagree at all, and your observations are very helpful. But I also see that there are 3 people with raised hands, and we've got about 1/4 hour left. So I'm going to move the conversation on and invite Matthew to talk and ask his question. Matthew.
Okay. I mean, I just wanted to say that I quite resonated with what Killian was talking about this idea of more simplicity and maybe I'm not as familiar of the first principles or what he was specifically talking about, but coming from my background in like participatory design, I really resonated with just kind of thinking about values and the manner in which we approach and we engage is maybe more important than problems or complex principles. It's more just like having a toolbox of community things that can get us to engage. It's more about the manner of how. So that's what I feel like we need as community, just thinking about how, because I think what Killian's talking about is everything will fall in line if we kind of engage with it in a we're kind of engaging with the same atmosphere, with the same energy. And, you know, I think that's what we can do as designers to orchestrate a system like that. But I'd love to talk about that more another time or hear more about it. I also resonated with what Daniel was saying, which seems like what we need to do right now is sense and listen. And so if that means like mapping this warm data in some way, I think we need more unpacking, unflattening, and juxtaposing, you know. And the issue that I'm running into, and I wanted to just get some input from you, is like I'm working on a project in the food industry, sustainable food systems, like a PhD research, but I feel like it's coming at from a very technical lens, the way it's been framed, which is not me. And so maybe other people have this issue as well, is that it's more about like, how can we take time to do the bioregional view in a system that may not support that time or perspective because it's because they want to use certain green technologies and embed them into the food system. But how can I, without leaving the PhD or not getting funded, like do you have any strategies of how we can slow down the system so that I can have time to focus on the nuances of the correct, any strategies there?
Strategies for slowing down time.
Or taking time within the context of maybe engineers or other people that business economics of trying to funnel in the technology, but yeah, wanting to approach it through a bioregional lens. Thank you.
I think
there are lots of strategies.
I think creating spaces where people can slow down and interact and have conversations is incredibly important. Our experience of working with local stakeholders is that when you bring them into a room where there are many different actors they don't normally interact with, and you give them space and time to reflect and think and exchange, it helps them to think differently. And I guess part of our work here that we're doing at the Bioregional Learning Centre in South Devon is definitely about creating spaces, slowing things down, asking questions, convening, bridging, making sure that people who don't normally talk to each other, that sectors that don't normally interact are able to interact. So kind of enabling that kind of thing to happen is a kind of slowing down process. So that's a technology for creating time and space. I'm sure Daniel's got some ideas.
I'm aware that there are many hands up and we don't have that much time left, but I put a couple of, because there was a couple of times this sort of, okay, well, what can we do tomorrow? What's healing community tools that we can just simply apply, and they will be somewhat different with different people in different places, but they're definitely good things. And there's the Post-Growth Institute has a number of really nice initiatives there. One of them is that they've highlighted the work of Shareable, this French collective that looked at 300 ways to help you nourish your community, from creating community-supported agriculture to local food regions to whatever, 300 different ways of building community and making people talk to each other again. And the basic offers and needs market that Donnie McLurkin developed and created this facilitator program around is also a process that just taps into the richness that exists in every community when people are starting to be willing to collaborate. That's on a very practical note. I think then the second half of the question went to a level of abstraction that I don't think we have time to go into a huge amount of detail, but I'd rather take another question. Is that okay?
Yeah, fantastic. Ria.
Wait, Isabel, if I may, just before we take another question, can I just name that we are offering that very process, Daniel, during this summit. We're calling them offers and request marketplaces. There are a bunch of them at all different times, and it's quite fascinating how many people come to these sessions, which are lovely and brilliant, and we're learning, and are not yet coming to those. So I want to invite us, if we really want to put things into practice, to consider participating in those as well, since we are taking the time to host them, and would love to see you there.
Wonderful. The power of them is, of course, in local place, which is maybe why you're not getting in, because people are coming in from all over. But it works on both levels.
Post-Growth Institute's been doing them virtually for some time, so I think they would disagree with you. Yes, of course, they're beautiful in local place too. And there's lots of ways we can support one another and ask for support, with this bioregioning work right now. I think there are a lot of people here that have requests and offers and maybe just didn't know, or, they're drawn to this because it's so stimulating. I'm not saying it's the wrong choice.
And thank you. I want to go over to Ria now for her question.
Thanks, Isabel. Hi, everybody. What rich conversation. I've been loving every part of this. Just wanted to start with that. I concur with what Matthew and Killian were putting forward I've been actively studying regenerative development for about 3.5 years now and love every aspect of it, though also really feel that there needs to be a balance constantly or consistently between sort of philosophizing and the spiritual component and all these incredibly important aspects of what it is and the action. I think we live in a world where there's the holistic and the linear, you know, the spiritual and the practical, the first principles, and then the, you know, the more abstract. And it's a balancing act constantly, though, you know, for all kinds of reasons, the how, the design, the application, you know, I'm absolutely in my own time, you know, teasing out practical sort of paths in as much detail or kind of with as much insight as I possibly can. And so actually, just to close off this call, I wanted to quickly share that I've been on a few other Zoom calls today, and having been a part of this community for the last week and a half, but also knowing Melina, having had the opportunity to talk to Daniel and being in Costa Rica before, I'm actually now in Mallorca, I really want to bring up that part of this and what's so important is youth involvement. And just as a quick thing to leave on, I can see that, you know, everybody on this call is of a certain, not to broadly label it in any kind of way, but, you know, certain demographic, generation, etc. And it's just a call to, again, go, how are we each showing up for, whether it be our children, grandchildren, people in the workplace, people within community, as mentors, sharing this wisdom to get to young people. And so my question is for that. So many young people want to get involved. They want to be accessing all of this knowledge, to be applying it in practical ways to actually start changing things in the systems that exist. So my question is to hosts and to anybody else. I've thought about it a lot, but what are ways that you would suggest bringing young people into bioregional regeneration as hows?
I'll go because it reminds me what we talked about this in person. It's so closely linked to something that I wanted to briefly mention as a closing comment. Let's not forget, like, the reason bioregions are a territory of consciousness and a story of place and a physical reality. The reason why I think regenerative cultural work is complementary in thinking about this. Like, you can think of how do we work for this bioregion is one question, and how do we cultivate a regenerative culture re-emerging in this place is a very related question. And for me, the culture question invites us into thinking what creates culture. And that's vital because it's linked to what you were just saying, Ria. Artists, poets, dancers, restoring the place in the most stunning way that is possible to make people fall in love with the place again, and to, in a playful way, without them even noticing, educate people about the interdependencies and their dependency to faraway places. And so how do you engage young people? You invite them to sing, dance, and engage with their relationship to the bioregion in a way that they feel part of the conversation and part of the solution. And the thing here is to not wait until we've got the bespoke and labeled and certified regenerative program for young people. In every region, there are now offers for a permaculture course, and that's a great place to start. Or there's so many educational offers that already take you into community and that space. But the real power, I think, will come if we enlist the power of the creative arts in all its forms to really express what we're talking about in a way that is infectious.
Okay, so my reply, quite rapid because we've got 2 minutes to go. So Daniel and I have both been fortunate enough to design and deliver programs for young people. Certainly one of our ambitions here in South Devon at the Bioregional Learning Centre is to start a learning program to make it possible for people to come to our place to see how bioregioning is working here, to understand how we're working with systems, how we're building relationships, and to be a training program for young people. I also want to flag up that in 3 hours' time, Edward Muller will be talking about, let me see what it's called, a global education system for regeneration. And he has a very similar vision, that it should be possible for young people and others to be able to go to these places, these kind of like sweet spots of bioregioning, where so much work is happening, and to learn on the ground what it's like to do that work, what it's like to lead that work. So things are starting to happen. They may not have happened yet. This is still quite a kind of a new movement, a new enterprise we're all engaged in, but transfer of knowledge is absolutely crucial to this. I completely agree.
Yeah, I just want to quickly
No,
say,
excuse me. I had my hand up, and this is not an open discussion. It's sequential.
But
my
Ria
question-
was speaking before Jesse, so I
3
think-
times.
Well,
This is
also we're at time, and we can't necessarily accommodate everyone.
everybody with something to say has many things to say, and we don't need to say them all.
My invitation is that we move everyone who wants to continue the conversation into a breakout and hit pause for the moment here, because we're at the top of the hour. I'm sorry that you didn't get a chance to speak in this session. You have your own session tomorrow, which I'd love to encourage people to go to.
I think that our problem is we haven't studied the crisis.
And you're offering to study it with people or share what you've learned in a session tomorrow, right?
Yes, of course.
And we're not done here. Just because we don't fit everything into one Zoom call doesn't mean that our opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm sorry to have to exercise a firm hand here, but I really do want to honor our time and our process.
1 o'clock.
Thank you, Daniel. Have a wonderful Samhain celebration. We shall think of you dancing around the fire with your children. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you for a great conversation. And yes, the conversations will keep going. That's the intention of the summit. They're not all happening just in 2 weeks, clearly. That 2 weeks is way too short. We want to help them continue beyond that.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, everyone.
Love to all.